they are deliberately killing huge numbers of Palestinians. This is not, accidental because there are human shields for whatever. This is a systematic attempt to make Gaza unlivable, to immiserate that population. In 1948, they just killed people and drove them out. And, a massacre here, a massacre there. I'm not trying to minimize the horrors of 1948, but there were only 15,000 people killed. When the bodies are dug up from under the ruins of Gaza, the number that you quoted, tens of thousands, is going to be a fraction.
Absolutely.
Wow, Professor Khalid Rashidi is so right about that. So, for those that don't know Professor Khalid Rashidi, he's a professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Politics at Columbia University. Extremely eloquent on the topic. He's written several books. I love listening to him. So, let's continue. But when he said that the tens of thousands of people will only be a fraction, that was so true because now we're finding out that the population of Gaza is only 1.8 million, right? Donald Trump said this recently. And if that's the case, and if you do the math, that could be somewhere around 400,000 to 600,000 people killed. If that's true, which would be horrifying.
Of the number killed. We don't know, and we won't know for a very long time. And the conditions to which the Palestinians have been subjected, this 1.5 million, almost 2 million people displaced again and again and again and again. I mean, this is unprecedented, even in Palestine's history.
Mm-hmm. What's the end game there? Is it just resettlement? What's the goal? What can you imagine the calculus is there?
I mean, we know from the beginning of the war that the original objective was to kick as many people out of Gaza as possible. And to the disgrace, the eternal disgrace of the United States, the American Secretary of State went around to Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia and tried to get them to take people that Israel would drive out of the Gaza Strip. So the original objective was ethnic cleansing of as many people from Gaza as could be removed. The Office of Management and Budget put into the appropriation bill for Israel that was actually passed, which included money for resettlement outside of Gaza. So the United States was going to help them to do this. We know that. That was the original goal. Now, they couldn't do it because Egypt wouldn't play along and Jordan wouldn't play along. But within the Gaza Strip, they seem to be forcing people into smaller and smaller areas. And again, that's what they did in 1948. They pushed as many people out of the area that they took during the 48 war. And that's what settler colonial projects always do. I mean, look what was done in North America, pushing Native Americans into smaller and smaller areas, the ones who weren't killed in the process.
Another piece of this is Lebanon. I mean, you, your wife, your children lived through Israel's invasion of Lebanon in 1982. How does that chapter relate to what we're seeing today?
I mean, there's similarities. There's an American green light. There are American resolutions. There are American vetoes of resolutions in the Security Council. The use of American weapons. I mean, there are a lot of similarities. Israel wasn't trying to colonize South Lebanon. Israel was trying to drive the PLO out, and Israel was perfectly happy to put militias, Lebanese militias, which it armed and trained and organized and directed, into refugee camps, as they did in Sabra and Shatila, to kill Palestinians. I mean, we know from discussions that were revealed between Israeli generals and Sharon and leaders of these militias that the idea was to empty the refugee camps. So there are some similarities. On the other hand, 19,000 people were killed, most of them civilians, in 1982. I mean, we're probably well over triple that number right now.
How much faith do you have that the international community will move differently?
I mean, part of the problem is that countries don't think that they dare cross the United States on this issue. I mean, if European countries would stand up on their hind legs, even if not all of them will, if a number of European countries would stand up on their hind legs and sanction Israel, say we're going to break our political cooperation agreements, we're going to stop allowing goods produced in the settlements to enter the EU, we're going to prevent Israeli, which many European states just did, we're going to prevent Israeli officials who have been issued with arrest warrants by the ICC from entering our territory. Britain has done that. Netherlands has done that. A number of European, they have to escalate that pressure. Yeah. They should sanction not just individual settlers. They should sanction Israeli ministers who are behind this annexation process.
I just personally, I mean, maybe I'm a bit cynical. I don't know if that would work. We've seen, like the retired professor had mentioned, that a lot of countries in Europe have done that. They have put sanctions. I think like Ireland, they have issued an arrest warrant for Literally the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. I think as long as Israel has America's backing, like blinded backing, no matter what they do, America will fight for them. So much of our government is taken over from, APAC funds them. A lot of them are people that are totally Israeli followers. Like, I just don't see how that would help. Maybe if all the European countries together put pressure on Israel, maybe America would reconsider. But I just don't really see it happen because their economies are nothing, right? I mean, how big? Compared to America, right?
They could easily do that in a way. Even in Western countries where the governments and the elites are still, laboring under these illusions that Israel fostered over many years, of everything they do is self-defense or human shields or whatever nonsense they peddle. Public opinion doesn't believe that stuff anymore. Even in most European countries, and certainly in the global South, nobody believes that stuff. And
Okay, that's true. That is definitely partially true. Like 10 years ago, the amount of criticism we hear towards Israel, especially in America, would be unheard of, right? 10 years ago, if you said anything anti Israel, even remotely anti Israel in politics in a debate, it's unheard of. Now you see it a lot more in both parties. You see big public figures speaking out against Israel. So, for sure, public sentiment is changing, and I think more so in Europe. So, that is one positive. People are finally waking up to it, but I still think we have a long way to go. There are still many, many people out there that are totally ignorant to the issue.
so there has been a change. And so you're right, over 4 or 5 years, you are seeing changes because governments are forced over time to listen to the voice of the people.
Now, saying if Netanyahu comes to our country, we will arrest him, is still not the same as taking an affirmative action and intervening more aggressively in the midst of a genocide.
Right.
Why are we not seeing more countries taking that step?
If you want my honest opinion, there's two things. The elites in these countries have not yet come to a realization that younger people who are looking at social media and are watching slaughter before their very eyes have come to. They're still living in another world. A lot of leaders, a lot of politicians. The second thing is they're afraid of the United States. I mean, to put it very bluntly, a lot of European countries do not want to cross Washington, and a lot of third world, a lot of global South countries do not want to cross Washington. And I think a lot of them are afraid of what may come in the Trump administration. They already were, having to face a lot of blowback from the Biden administration. That's not going to get any better, and it may get worse under Trump.
Breakable it is, maybe. It seems that without the United States, this thing would end very quickly. I can't imagine Israel could continue to prosecute a genocidal war without U.S. support. Maybe a few months. Some
The Israeli press has said they can't go on for more than 3 or 4 months without these constant shipments of ammunition and resupply and new tubes for the artillery and for the tank guns. I mean, that's what they say. And that's undoubtedly true. The United States is a participant in this war. It's not just that American officials, according to the New York Times and the Washington Post and the BBC, are helping the Israelis to kill leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah. It's not just that American troops are on the ground with anti-aircraft and anti-missile defenses. It is that the whole war machine would grind to a halt within a matter of months, according to what the Israelis say their military says in the Security Council since this war began. So the United States is an active participant in this war.
But why are they so committed to this relationship? Why do they not pull out? I mean, we spoke to political scientist John Mearsheimer, and he argues that the U.S. commitment to Israel stems primarily from the influence of the Israel lobby, which works to shape U.S. foreign policy in a pro-Israel direction. But others say it's the other way around, that the U.S. has much to gain from having a kind of staunch ally, that it's a strategic motivation rather than the lobby issue. What's your perspective?
Personally, my perspective is that Israel's lobby, AIPAC, pays off all of our politicians, and that's why they have so much influence. And I think everyone knows that. I think that's super clear. I don't think Israel is that much of a staunch ally in the Middle East. We have many allies in the Middle East: Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Like, these guys all are allies. And yeah, sure, they don't listen to everything we say, but Israel doesn't really either. But I do think we have a lot more influence, unfortunately, on the other countries like Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. We have a lot more influence there than Israel. Israel will straight up just say no to us many times. Look at the Biden administration. So yeah, I definitely think it's the influence from APAC.
It's really clear that for a lot of American military officials and strategists, they see, first of all, they're interventionists. They believe in force. And Israel is a tool in that arsenal. During the Cold War, it helped the United States to beat down Soviet proxies, defeating countries armed by the Soviet Union. And in Cold War, that black and white, zero-sum game, that was an advantage to the United States. And that was the anchor of the strategic aspect of the American-Israeli relationship. And the United States is at odds with Iran. And so Israel is seen as a potential ally in that. Now, I would argue the Israelis are trying to drag the United States into a war with Iran that the United States doesn't want, that most American strategists, leaders, military officials know would be a catastrophe. It would also be an election loser. Anybody who gets the United States into a war with Iran will lose the next election.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Where was the support for the Palestinians? Where were the Palestinians? They didn't exist. There was none. Where was the support for Israel? It was robust among evangelicals, in the Jewish community, among politicians. From Wilson right up to the last decade or two, there was no support whatsoever anywhere in American public opinion for the Palestinians. They did not exist. Now that's changed. Most Americans oppose this war. Democrats, Republicans, Independents. Most Americans want to stop U.S. arms shipments to Israel. Most Americans detest Netanyahu. I mean, there's poll after poll after poll that shows this is a solid trend over the better part of a year. This is new. The politicians have still not, begun to bring this into their calculus.
But is there a danger in the focus being on the particular regime as opposed to the system and structure itself?
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head. The problem is not Netanyahu. Netanyahu has a government that includes politicians from 3/4 of the way or halfway across the Israeli political spectrum. And what he is doing is popular in Israel. If it's not Netanyahu, it's going to be someone else. This is a popular war in Israel, in spite of Israel's losses. What the settler movement has been doing has met almost no pushback inside Israel. So if Netanyahu were to disappear tomorrow on criminal charges or lose a no confidence vote, I don't think very much would change, frankly. And I think that the focus on Netanyahu is, to some extent, an attempt to divert criticism from long-standing basic Israeli policies, which Netanyahu today represents, but which will continue after Netanyahu.
When he was a senator back in the old days, U.S. President Joe Biden was the largest recipient of AIPAC money.
He is the largest recipient of pro-Israel money of anybody who's ever served in the U.S. Senate. $1.4 million over his career.
How does that impact? Does it impact policy directly?
I mean, we live in a country in which legalized bribery is the basis of our political system. Politicians shill for money from big donors, and that's the way the system works. So obviously money has a role to play. But I mean, I would argue public opinion has a role to play. Think about how many people ever in the history of the U.S. Congress stood up and criticized Israel. And how long did they last? Senator Percy, Jim Aburizik, Pete McCloskey. You can literally count them on the fingers of one hand, and you can count the number of terms they served on the fingers,
right.
A couple of fingers. That's now changing. I mean, you had 19 senators who had the courage to stand up and call for a halt to arms sales to Israel. That's unprecedented. There has never been a bloc in Congress of people with the courage to stand up to AIPAC and the courage to represent what most of their constituents actually believe. That's new. But you're right, the power of AIPAC is still there. This is a terrible moment. People are being slaughtered by the dozens every single day by American weapons in violation of U.S. law. They're basically engaging themselves in criminal activity in violation of U.S. law by allowing American weapons to be used in the way that they're being used, not for defensive purpose. I mean, how does killing 500 people meet any definition of to kill one Hamas leader or one Hezbollah leader, meet a definition of defensive purposes? How does starving the population of Gaza and preventing the 400 or 500 trucks that should be going in every day not meet the definition of this is a violation of U.S. law in terms of preventing humanitarian aid? I mean, there's no way that this stuff is not a violation of U.S. law. These people are actually all criminals in terms of U.S. law.
So I guess what I'm struggling with is if it's violating our own domestic policies and it's clearly unethical and it's clearly not bringing this quote unquote war to any kind of halt and it's wildly unpopular, with the American people. Why are Democrats willing to die on this hill? Why? It seems like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris both may have lost the chance to be president in next January precisely because they wouldn't push back against these policies. Why? Why is this happening?
With the fact, if you look back at other wars in which the United States was involved, the Vietnam War, the Iraq War, it took a really long time for public opinion that had turned overwhelmingly against these wars to finally force the politicians to change what they were doing. Yeah. And it's going to take a while. This has been a year, and we're in our 14th month of this war. It's still going to take a while. These people have dug on positions and believe things that the Israelis say that are not going to change very quickly. It's going to take intense pressure from below.
Politicians are usually good at self-preservation.
Yeah, but you take any important measure that majorities of American people are in agreement on, something to do with health care or something to do with abortion. And the politicians will just go against that because there are other interests at play, the big pharma, the military-industrial complex. I mean, we talk about AIPAC as if it's the only lobby. It's not. There are a lot of other people who want to keep wars going, including the people who sell weapons.
That's fair.
And those folks have factories in almost every state, and they have unions that are working with good jobs in those factories. So there's a whole range of vested interests behind keeping this war going, or keeping all wars going.
Professor Rashidi is correct, and I do believe that the next generation, you can tell very clearly on TikTok, on Instagram, that in the next 10 to 15 years, I think politicians' eyes will open up when they start losing elections. They are very, very pro-Palestine. Go on TikTok and just watch. They're very pro-Palestine. That generation is growing up. They will have the ability to vote soon, and I think it is going to happen soon.
You talk about these young people, and I think you're right. On college campuses,
Yeah.
very different. I mean,
Right.
there's a strong pro-Palestine sentiment there, but that's the students.
Right.
I was wondering if you saw a similar shift among the faculty. Just recently, Mara Finkelstein, a tenured associate professor at Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania, was terminated for reposting an Instagram story that featured a statement from a Palestinian poet.
Right.
She's not the only professor who's had scrutiny, although she's maybe the first tenured professor to be fired for this
I think
matter.
that may be true, yes.
Yeah. How secure is academia for people who support Palestine these days?
To what extent are faculty under pressure? They're under enormous pressure. I mean, several of my colleagues are facing disciplinary proceedings at Columbia. Lots of staff are under pressure. Staff have been fired.
Yeah.
Contingent faculty are under much greater pressure, non-tenured faculty, graduate students. The mechanisms of repression are concerted, are often in coordination with law enforcement, are operating according to the dictates of right-wing politicians like Virginia Fox and Elise Stefanik, who were on the House Education Committee and brought those presidents in for a grilling. And the donors and a lot of the parents and a lot of the alumni are putting huge pressure on American universities to crack down. So the older people, the more conservative people, are weighing in with their money, with their voices, and as are the politicians. So the atmosphere is actually very, very harsh, not just for students, but also for faculty and staff. I mean, frankly, I think education is under attack at this point. It's not just, advocacy around Palestine. That's the wedge issue for these people. I don't think Elise Stefanik and Virginia Fox and the Republican Party care that much about Palestinians or anti-Semitism. They want to target black studies. They want to target gender equality. They want to target a whole range of things which in academia are respectable and considered important, and which they would like to eliminate from American education. They're already showing in how they treat K through 12 education, removing books from libraries and mandating you can't teach this and you can't teach that. That's what they'd like to do to American universities. And the leadership of American universities are blindly walking into that trap, are blindly playing their game, or maybe with eyes open, in which case they're even guiltier of malfeasance in terms of their basic responsibilities, which are to protect higher education from interference by ill-intentioned politicians, which is what we are facing over this wedge issue, but which is really intended to hit much more broadly. I think higher education is in peril because of the unwillingness of educational leaders to stand up and say, you cannot say this, you cannot do this, we will not accept your bogus congressional subpoenas, whatever it takes to dig in their heels and fight back against this, 21st century McCarthyism.
You talked about how in Palestine, quote, there is no unified leadership or collective strategic vision. Why?
The Palestinian people are at a very low point in their history. You've had times when that was the case, that leadership had been shattered, dispersed. The Palestinians were politically disorganized. They had no strategic aims, collective, unified consensus strategic aims. That was the case in the 50s into the 60s. And it's the case today, unfortunately. The direction that the PLO took in terms of negotiating and establishing the PA proved to be a failure. It did not produce self-determination. It did not produce an end to settlements and colonization. In fact, it made things much, much worse for Palestinians.
Is it safe to say that whatever the new leadership model is, it won't come out of the current political structure, i.e., it won't come from Fatah, it won't come from Hamas, that it's going to have to be something new produced?
I mean, what happened in the 30s when Palestinians came together for a while, and what happened in the 60s and 70s when the Palestinians came together for a while, is that some remnants of the old melded with a lot of elements of the new. I think that you need younger people to step in. I mentioned the fact that the United States is ruled by a gerontocracy. Schumer, Biden, Pelosi, these are people who really should step off the stage. Most of the Senate, they should step off the stage.
And the incoming president.
The oldest president in history. Looking at the situation today, I don't think Israel has ever been as isolated as it is today, globally. I don't think anybody would argue with that. I don't think that Israelis have ever been so divided over as many issues as they are today. And by that I mean judicial reform before the war.
Right.
And that's still a burning issue. By that I mean the fate of the Israeli hostages, complete division. And by that I mean, finally, something that I don't think has yet bubbled to the surface, but whether Israelis want to die on the hill of reestablishing a settlement in the Gaza Strip, or whether Israelis want to die on the hill of further expanding settlement in the West Bank. Right now, the settlement movement is riding high. They dominate this government. Yeah. They have in the Minister of Finance, they have in the Minister of Public Security, the two strongest advocates they've ever had. And those guys are determining what Israel does. They might as well be the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister. Netanyahu almost looks like their little lapdog half the time. But that doesn't represent a majority of Israelis. And sooner or later, I think those I don't know what, chickens are going to come home to roost. The other thing is, they are now in the process of establishing another military government over Gaza and some kind of military control, perhaps, over part of Lebanon. That means a lot of soldiers are going to die. And
it's never popular.
The people who are advocating for that, I don't think are calculating how 9 or 12 or 18 months down the pike, soldiers and reservists, conscripts and reservists and families of these people are going to look at, do we really want to control Khiem into 2027? Do we really want to control Beit Lahia? By control, meaning having a soldier die every day. Since October 1st, 87 Israeli soldiers, by Israel's count, have been killed in Gaza and southern Lebanon. Now, the count may go down, but a continued occupation is going to mean casualties. I mean, what they sooner or later have to realize is they cannot rule over another people. It never worked in the past. Decolonization always happens sooner or later. And they have to give up their addiction to force. I mean, there's an Israeli adage, if force doesn't work, use more force. Well, it hasn't worked very well. And it's not working, and it's not going to work. You can kill and kill and kill. You can take out level after level after level of leadership. And they've been doing it for decades. And they're in a worse situation today than they were decades ago when this policy of assassinations and this policy of killing civilians in order to prevent them from supporting insurgency and resistance started. It never worked for colonial powers like the British, who taught the Israelis everything they know. And it hasn't worked for the Israelis.
What does this all mean for Palestinians?
It means a
Make sure you like this video and subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. I'll see you in the next one.
lot of death. It means a lot of suffering. It means continuation of rule by this awfully oppressive power That's what it means for Palestinians.